It all began with the sound of splintering wood, a sound that echoed through the quiet air like a violent crack of thunder. My lake cabin, the place where my family gathered every summer, the place that held my childhood memories and my father's legacy, was being torn down before my eyes. The heavy machines moved in with brutal precision, their metal jaws biting into the walls I once painted with my own hands. Dust filled the air, drowning the scent of pine trees and lake water, replacing it with the stench of destruction. And for what? For so-called unpaid HOA fees? That was the excuse. That was the story the homeowners association told the neighborhood. But they had no idea who they were dealing with, and they certainly had no clue that my entire family carried badges and clearances that stretched into the deepest layers of the federal government. To understand how it came to this, how an HOA pushed me to the edge, believing they had unchecked power over my property, you have to know the story of the cabin itself. My father built it decades ago, long before there was any association or committee dictating how people should live. It wasn't grand or flashy, it was simple. A wood and stone retreat tucked against the shoreline of a wide, glistening lake. It was the kind of place where mornings meant coffee steaming on the porch, evenings meant campfires by the water, and summers meant a gathering of family who lived for too long under the pressure of jobs that demanded silence and sacrifice. The HOA came later, as they always do. Developers decided to reshape the quiet community into something marketable, something polished, something wrapped in rules and restrictions that they claimed protected property values. In truth, it was just another power grab. They slapped on fees, wrote up codes about paint colors, and imposed penalties for leaving a kayak too close to the shoreline. At first, I ignored them. The cabin was ours long before they appeared, and my family paid the property taxes on time, every time. The association had no legal authority over us, or so I believed. But they had other plans. When my father passed, the cabin became more than property. It became a promise. I vowed to maintain it not just as a home, but as a sanctuary, a reminder that beyond the noise of the world, beyond the dangerous work my family often undertook in silence, there was this one safe place. Every nail I replaced, every board I sanded, felt like a way of keeping him alive. So when the HOA began sending letters, thin envelopes with bold red lettering demanding compliance and payment of fees, I didn't see them as official documents. I saw them as intrusions, insults. They demanded hundreds of dollars in dues for landscaping I never approved, security gates I never used, and community amenities I never accessed. I wrote back firmly, I am not a member of your association. My property predates your development. You have no authority here. That was the beginning of the storm. The setup was gradual, insidious. It wasn't one single attack, but a series of annoyances that piled up until they became unbearable. First, I noticed fines attached to my mailbox. Improper signage, overgrown vegetation, unapproved structure repairs. Each was nothing more than a flimsy accusation meant to corner me into acknowledging their power. Then came the neighbors, some sympathetic, some indoctrinated. They'd mention the HOA meetings, the whispers that my cabin was an eyesore, that it brought down the value of the neighborhood. It was laughable. My cabin stood stronger and more authentic than the cookie-cutter houses surrounding it, homes that looked like they'd been pulled from a catalog, but the HOA wasn't content with gossip and letters. They wanted submission. And when I didn't bend, they escalated. I started receiving threats of liens, vague legal language meant to intimidate. At night, I'd find notices taped to the cabin door declaring that my property was in violation of this or that rule. Each time I documented. It stored the evidence, but I never responded in the way they wanted. My refusal was gasoline on their fire. Still, I wasn't prepared for the day they moved from words to action. It was late spring when I returned to the cabin after a week away, only to find bright orange markers driven into the ground. Stakes, lined with ribbon, encircled my property like a noose. Attached to the door was a notice, demolition scheduled due to unpaid assessments and unsafe structure determination. My heart froze. Unsafe. The cabin was sound. I maintained it myself with care and precision. Unpaid assessments. I owed them nothing. This wasn't negligence, it was war. You might wonder why I didn't simply storm into their office and flash a badge. After all, when your family wears the federal shield, doors tend to open quickly. But this wasn't about flexing power too early. It was about patience. It was about letting them believe they had won, letting them dig their own grave of arrogance. My family had taught me better than to rush into a fight. We gathered evidence. We built cases. We let the enemy expose themselves before lowering the hammer, and so, as I stood there staring at the demolition notice, rage boiling beneath the surface, I knew I was looking at the beginning of something much bigger. They weren't just threatening my cabin, they were challenging the very idea of fairness, daring to test how far they could push someone they thought was powerless. But I wasn't powerless. My entire life had been shaped by discipline, by watching my family work in the shadows of justice, dismantling corruption that thrived on intimidation. The HOA had no idea that by targeting me, they had awakened a force they couldn't possibly control. The first swing of the wrecking machine came weeks later. But even before that moment, the tension in the air was unbearable. Every letter, every visit, every sneer from the HOA president felt like the tightening of a vice. The community whispered, some watching with pity, others with smug satisfaction, as if they believed I was finally being put in my place. They didn't know what I knew. They didn't see what was coming, and so, as the walls of my cabin splintered and collapsed, as dust choked the air and cheers rose faintly from the HOA office across the street, I held my silence. They thought it was over. They thought they had won. But the truth was, they had just stepped into the kind of battle they would never escape unscathed. For when my family moves, we don't move quietly. And what was about to unfold would not only expose the corruption of a petty HOA, but remind them and everyone watching that some lines should never be crossed. The demolition of the cabin was the climax of their arrogance, but the battle didn't truly begin there. No, it started in the months leading up to that destruction, when the HOA turned their petty rules into weapons and decided to make an example out of me. At first, it was laughable. They fined me for the color of my shutters, claiming it didn't match the approved palette for the neighborhood. My shutters had been painted the same deep forest green since the cabin was built, decades before the HOA existed. I ignored the notice, but ignoring them was like feeding a stray animal. It only made them hungrier. Soon after, I found another violation. The gravel path leading to the dock was labeled unapproved landscaping. Then came a warning about my woodpile, stacked neatly behind the cabin, being unsightly. Each notice was written in bureaucratic jargon, dripping with condescension, signed by the HOA president himself, Richard Alderman. Richard was the kind of man who thrived on control. He wore his title like a crown, lording over neighbors with smug authority. He wasn't just enforcing rules, he was inventing them. I had heard stories from others in the community. A retired couple fined for planting sunflowers without prior approval. A single mother threatened with eviction for leaving her trash bins visible for more than 2 hours after pickup. These were not rules meant to maintain order. They were tactics of dominance, designed to remind everyone who held power. But Richard made a mistake when he chose me. The escalation was relentless. Letters turned into certified warnings. Certified warnings became threats of legal action. Each one claimed I owed the association dues, fees, or penalties that grew larger every month. The absurdity was staggering. One notice demanded payment for community security enhancements, though the so-called security amounted to nothing more than a padlocked gate that anyone could bypass on foot. Another charged me for shared lake maintenance, despite the fact that my family owned a private stretch of shoreline separate from the community docks. By the third month, the supposed balance due had ballooned into the thousands. The claimed I was delinquent, irresponsible, and in violation of covenants I had never agreed to. Richard began parading my name at meetings, declaring me a danger to the neighborhood, a stain on their carefully curated image. Neighbors started to avoid eye contact. Some whispered apologies when they thought no one was looking, while others bought into the HOS narrative, treating me as though I were reckless or untrustworthy. Then the harassment left paper and entered the physical world. One evening, I arrived at the cabin to find bright orange spray paint across the driveway. Pay your dues. Another time, the tires of my truck had been deflated, slow leaks that left me stranded for hours. Someone broke into the shed behind the cabin, scattering tools across the ground as if to send a message. I had no proof it was Richard or his cronies, but I knew the timing was too precise, too pointed. The HOA had elevated their campaign from bureaucratic pressure to intimidation. Still, I didn't strike back, not yet. My family had taught me the value of patience, of letting arrogance build until it tipped into self-destruction. Every notice, every vandalized corner of my property, every whispered threat was documented. I photographed, I filed, I stored it all. To the HOA, it looked like silence. To me, it was preparation. But their hunger for control knew no limits. The next blow came in the form of a lien notice. According to the HOA, my property was now officially under lien for unpaid fees, making it subject to foreclosure and repossession. The audacity was staggering. They were attempting to take my father's cabin, our family's sanctuary, on the back of fabricated debts. The notice claimed authority through bylaws, referencing covenants and amendments that were never legally binding on my property. Yet Richard paraded it like a weapon, waving it in the faces of anyone who dared question him. The pressure mounted. From all sides, banks began to send letters of inquiry, questioning whether the lien might impact the value of the property. Insurance companies hinted at withdrawing coverage due to ongoing legal disputes. What had once been a battle with a petty HOA president was beginning to ripple outward, threatening the very stability of my family's legacy. But Richard wasn't done. He wanted spectacle. That summer, the HOA organized a community meeting, inviting nearly every homeowner around the lake. They called it a special hearing, though in reality it was nothing more than a public shaming. I didn't attend, but word spread quickly. Richard stood before the group with enlarged photos of my cabin, pointing out fabricated violations. He claimed the structure was unsafe, that the shoreline was eroding due to my neglect, that I posed a threat to the environment and property values. It was theater, designed to rally the crowd. Some nodded, others questioned, but in the end, Richard declared that the association would be taking decisive action. That was when the demolition order appeared. The notice stapled to my door claimed the cabin was condemned, unsafe for habitation and scheduled for removal. It was a lie so bold, so breathtaking in its audacity, that for a moment I couldn't decide whether to laugh or explode. Condemned? I had spent years reinforcing the structure, replacing beams, sanding floors, sealing leaks. A cabin was stronger than half the homes in the neighborhood. But Richard wasn't after truth, he was after power. He wanted to send a message that no one, not even a family with deep roots and rightful ownership, could resist. The HOA neighbors began to stop by quietly, some offering sympathy, others urging me to comply for the sake of peace. I listened but said little. Inside, the storm raged hotter each day. My family checked in, asking if I wanted them to step in early, to use their authority to crush the HOA before they took another step. But I said no. Timing was everything. Let them show their hand. Let them push until there was no room left for doubt. The more they overreached, the harder the fall would be when truth came to light. The day the demolition crew arrived, the air was thick with tension. Orange cones lined the road. Heavy machinery rumbled down the gravel drive, flanked by men in hard hats carrying clipboards. Richard was there, of course, standing tall in his pressed polo shirt, his arms folded smugly as if he were overseeing a coronation. The sight of him lit a fire in me, but I stayed back, silent, watching from the edge of the property. The first swing of the excavator's arm shattered the quiet. Wood splintered, glass burst. The walls of my cabin groaned under the assault. I felt every strike like a personal wound. My father's porch swing was crushed. The stone chimney crumbled. Dust rose into the air, choking out the scent of pine. replacing it with the stench of destruction. And Richard smiled. He actually smiled as he watched it fall, but what Richard didn't know was that every second of this so-called legal demolition was being recorded. Cameras had been set up, witnesses were present, documents had been filed, and my family quietly, invisibly had already begun pulling threads behind the scenes, tracing the HOS finances, their fraudulent claims, their misuse of power. Richard thought he was untouchable. He believed his title shielded him from consequence. He had no idea he had just crossed into territory where consequences weren't just possible, they were inevitable. As the dust settled and the cabin lay in ruins, the HOA celebrated what they thought was victory. But I stood there in silence, watching the smoke rise, knowing the game had only just begun. They thought they had broken me, erased my sanctuary, and humiliated me before the community. But the truth was, they had only tightened the noose around their own necks. And soon they would learn the kind of mistake they had made when they targeted not just an ordinary homeowner, but a family forged in the very heart of federal justice. The dust from the demolition lingered in the air for hours, drifting over the lake like a shroud. Where once stood my family's cabin, our sanctuary, our inheritance, our legacy, now lay nothing but splintered wood, shattered glass, and a chimney reduced to rubble. I stayed there long after the machines had gone, long after the HOA members had congratulated themselves and left with smug smiles plastered across their faces. To them it was finished. To me it was only the beginning. Richard Alderman thought he had crushed me. He thought he had humiliated the last holdout who refused to bend to his rules. He stood tall on that day, watching the cabin fall, convinced he had displayed his power to the entire neighborhood. But what Richard didn't know was that power built on arrogance is fragile, and once the truth begins to crack it open, it collapses. Faster than a rotten beam under pressure. For weeks after the demolition, the paraded their victory. They circulated newsletters boasting of the safety measures taken to protect the community. They framed my cabin's destruction as a triumph of order over chaos, of responsibility over neglect. Richard's name appeared in bold at the top of every announcement, his words dripping with self-importance. Neighbors received letters reminding them that the HOA had the authority to act when individuals failed to comply. Fear crept through the community. People whispered about what had happened to me, shaking their heads but staying silent. Silence was exactly what Richard wanted, but silence was never my plan. The night after the demolition, I gathered the evidence I had collected for months, every violation notice. Every threat, every lien, every fraudulent charge, I spread it across a table like puzzle pieces, each one connecting to the next, forming a picture of corruption and abuse of power so clear it could not be ignored. My father used to say that truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be revealed at the right time, and this was that time. I wasn't alone. My family had been watching, waiting. My brother, a federal investigator with a knack for financial trails, had already uncovered irregularities in the HOS accounts, funds siphoned from dues into private accounts, payments disguised as maintenance that never reached contractors. My cousin, an attorney with the Department of Justice, had quietly drafted the legal framework for what was to come. My mother, retired from a federal regulatory agency, had flagged violations in how the HOA had filed its tax records. Each of them, in their own way, had sharpened the blade. All that remained was to strike. The strike came swiftly. It began with a letter not from me, but from a federal office bearing a seal Richard had never expected to see on his desk. The HOA was informed of an active investigation into financial misconduct, fraudulent liens, and abuse of authority. Subpoenas followed. Bank accounts were frozen. Meetings that once served as Richard's stage turned into interrogations. The very people he had lorded over began to question him, fear replacing the smug confidence they once carried in his presence. But the most devastating blow came when the story broke publicly. Local news outlets picked it up first. Lakefront HOA accused of fraud, illegal demolition. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, cameras capturing the ruins of my cabin as the backdrop to interviews with residents. Some spoke out about the years of harassment, the endless fines, the fear of speaking against Richard. What once was whispered in private now spilled into the open. Neighbors who had cowered in silence found their voices, emboldened by the sight of authority turning its gaze on the HOA. Richard tried to fight back. He called the investigation a misunderstanding, claiming the HOA acted within its rights, but every word he spoke dug him deeper. Evidence piled against him: emails, bank records, testimonies. The more he resisted, the more the truth exposed his rot. Then came the moment Richard could never have anticipated. A federal hearing was scheduled, and as part of the process, Richard was summoned to testify. He walked into that room expecting another chance to perform, to spin his lies in the presence of officials who, in his mind, were just another set of bureaucrats to manipulate. But when he sat down, he saw faces he didn't expect: my family's faces, my brother, seated with the financial investigators, my cousin standing among the attorneys, my mother advising the panel on regulatory violations, and me seated in the gallery, silent, unflinching, watching. The color drained from his face when recognition hit him. For months, he had believed he was fighting a single stubborn homeowner. He thought he was tormenting a lone individual with no resources, no power. But in that instant, he realized he had been waging war against an entire family woven into the fabric of federal justice. The hearing was brutal. Every accusation he had thrown at me was dismantled, every fraudulent charge laid bare. His financial schemes were mapped out in painful detail, his misuse of HOA funds exposed line by line. Residents testified against him, recounting years of harassment and intimidation. The lies Richard had built his empire upon crumbled in the face of undeniable truth. When the gavel fell, Richard wasn't the towering figure he once was. He was small, broken, cornered. Federal charges loomed. Civil suits stacked against him. His empire of rules and fines and intimidation had turned to dust. And for the first time, the community saw him not as a ruler, but as the petty, corrupt bully he had always been. As he was led out of the room, his eyes flicked toward me. There was no smugness left, no arrogance, only the hollow stare of a man who finally understood the weight of the mistake he had made. He had thought he was untouchable, but he had touched the wrong family. The climax wasn't the demolition of my cabin. It wasn't even Richard's downfall. The real climax was the shift in power, the moment when the community realized they were free. Free from the grip of a tyrant, free from the fear that had haunted their lives for years. It was the moment when silence turned into voices, when isolation turned into solidarity. Richard's downfall wasn't just mine, it belonged to everyone he had ever tried to control, and standing there, watching the walls of his empire collapse, I knew one thing with certainty: the cabin may have been reduced to rubble, but the spirit it carried, the spirit of my father, of my family, of truth, was stronger than ever. Richard had thought he destroyed me, but in truth he had destroyed himself. Richard's downfall didn't end in the courtroom. That was only the opening act of his collapse. The true resolution came in the days, weeks, and months that followed, when the consequences of his greed and arrogance unfolded piece by piece, stripping away everything he thought untouchable. The federal investigation that began with subpoenas and hearings expanded like wildfire. Agents sifted through years of financial records, uncovering layers of fraud Richard had hidden beneath the HOS official paperwork. Dues collected for maintenance had been funneled into accounts under his name. Funds set aside for security had been used to pay for his personal vacations. Even the so-called emergency reserves the HOA demanded from residents had been siphoned into investments benefiting only Richard and a handful of his closest allies. When news outlets picked up the story, the community's name became infamous overnight. HOA fraud scandal rocks lakefront neighborhood, read one headline. Reporters flocked to the gates Richard once bragged about, eager to capture the image of a community that had become a national symbol of HOA corruption. Residents who had once been afraid to speak now lined up to tell their stories on camera. They spoke of fines that seemed to appear out of nowhere, of threats delivered in the dead of night, of livelihoods nearly destroyed by Richard's unchecked power. Their words painted a picture far darker than anyone had realized. That board. Once Richard's loyal circle crumbled under pressure. Some resigned immediately, claiming ignorance. Others tried to shift blame, insisting they had only followed Richard's lead. But the investigation spared no one. Those who had signed off on fraudulent documents faced their own charges. Those who had benefited from Richard's schemes were forced to repay what they had taken. The empire Richard had built on intimidation. And greed was dismantled brick by brick, until nothing remained but shame and lawsuits. For Richard himself, the consequences were brutal. Federal charges of fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of authority carried heavy weight. He lost his position, his home, and his reputation in one sweeping blow. Neighbors who once cowered before him now avoided him entirely, unwilling to be seen. In the orbit of a man whose name had become synonymous with corruption, the man who once stood on my property with a smile as he watched my cabin fall was now escorted everywhere in handcuffs, his arrogance replaced with the hollow stare of defeat. But justice didn't end with Richard. The demolition of my cabin had been illegal, and that act carried its own repercussions. The contractors who carried out the order found themselves under investigation for failing to verify the legitimacy of the notice they acted upon. Civil suits mounted against the HOA, demanding restitution for the destruction of private property. My family's legal team moved swiftly, filing claims not only for the cabin itself but for the emotional and financial damage inflicted by the HOA campaign. What had once been a quiet corner of the lake was now the epicenter of a legal battle that drew eyes from across the country. And then came the rebuilding. The land where my cabin once stood was scarred, the ruins a painful reminder of what had been lost. But to me, it wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. With restitution funds secured and support from neighbors who had watched the injustice unfold, I began the process of reconstruction. Not just of the cabin, but of the community itself. When the first new beams were raised, it wasn't just a structure being built, it was a statement. Neighbors gathered to watch, some offering help, others bringing food or tools. Where once fear had silenced them, now solidarity brought them together. They spoke openly of their own experiences, of how Richard's tyranny had shaped their lives, and how free they finally felt to stand up for themselves. The cabin became more than mine. It became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that injustice can be torn down, but truth always rebuilds stronger. Each plank, each nail, each stone laid into the foundation was filled with meaning. I remember my father's hands when I worked, the way he had taught me to measure twice and cut once, to take pride in the details. This time, the cabin was not just a family sanctuary. It was a monument to the strength that comes when silence ends and courage speaks. The broader impact was undeniable. The scandal spurred lawmakers to take notice. Local officials, embarrassed by how an HOA had run unchecked for so long, began drafting reforms. Conversations about HOA power, abuse, and oversight spread far beyond our lakefront. Communities across the state, across the country, began questioning their own associations, demanding accountability, transparency, and limits. What had begun as a battle over one cabin had grown into a spark that lit a much larger fire for me and my family. The journey came full circle one evening as the sun set over the lake. We stood on the new porch, the wood still smelling fresh, the view stretching wide across waters that had borne witness to so much. The cabin stood again, stronger, brighter, more defiant than ever. My family gathered around, each of us knowing the fight had not just been for wood and stone, but for legacy, for principle, for justice. Neighbors stopped by that night, no longer fearful, but filled with relief. They thanked us not just for standing against Richard, but for showing them that power is not untouchable, that even the most entrenched corruption can fall when truth stands against it. Some spoke of how they planned to challenge their own HOAS rules, others of how they felt hope for the first time in years. The cabin's light reached further than its walls, and yet, amid the rebuilding, the justice, the victory, there lingered a sobering truth. Not every battle like this ends with accountability. Too many homeowners suffer in silence. Too many lives are quietly dismantled by those who wield power with arrogance and malice. My story was one of survival and triumph, but I knew it was also a rare one. That reality burned in me like a call to action, because the real resolution wasn't simply Richard's downfall or the cabin's reconstruction. It was the reminder that power unchecked is dangerous, that silence only feeds corruption, and that standing up, no matter the cost, is the only way to reclaim what's right. I looked out across the lake, the rebuilt cabin behind me, and the weight of the past months heavy on my shoulders. One thought lingered. Richard thought demolishing my cabin would end me, but in truth it ended him. And perhaps in some small way, it began something bigger than either of us could have imagined. In the end, it wasn't the sound of destruction that stayed with me. It wasn't the roar of machines tearing through wood and stone, or the image of Richard Alderman smiling smugly as the cabin collapsed. What lingered was the silence that followed the quiet after the storm. The stillness of the lake reflecting the ruins of what once was. That silence forced me to face what had been lost, and also what had been gained. The cabin was more than just a building. It was memory and tradition. It was summers with my father teaching me how to tie knots, winters spent repairing leaks while the snow fell heavy outside, evenings when my family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset ripple across the water. It was laughter, struggle, and history. Losing it should have broken me. And for a moment, as the walls crumbled, I thought it had, but destruction is never the final word. Sometimes it is the spark of renewal. Richard believed power came from intimidation, from bending others to his will, from silencing those who resisted. He thought rules were weapons, and authority was his personal shield. What he never understood was that true power doesn't come from fear, it comes from truth. Truth doesn't tremble when challenged, it grows stronger. It doesn't vanish. When buried, it waits patiently until the time comes to rise. That truth rose the moment the first subpoena landed on Richard's desk. It rose when neighbors who had once whispered in fear began to speak openly, their voices shaking but determined. It rose when my family stepped forward, not with anger but with the quiet weight of evidence and authority. And it rose in me, transforming grief into determination, silence into action. The consequences for Richard were severe. His reputation, his finances, his influence all shattered. The man who strutted through the neighborhood as though he owned. It now lived under the weight of criminal charges, civil suits, and disgrace. But perhaps the greatest consequence wasn't his alone. It was the awakening of a community. I watched neighbors rediscover courage in the aftermath. They walked taller, spoke louder, no longer looking over their shoulders for Richard's approval. They gathered not in fear but in solidarity, reclaiming the sense of belonging that had been stolen from them. The HOA, once a symbol of unchecked authority, was dissolved, its remnants replaced by a cooperative model where decisions were made transparently with accountability. The fear that had hung over every home like a shadow was gone. For me, the rebuilding of the cabin was both practical and symbolic. Each board I nailed into place carried the memory of what had been lost, but also the promise of what was being created. When the new roof was raised, it felt like closing a wound. When the porch was finished, it felt like reclaiming my father's voice, reminding me that legacy isn't destroyed by bulldozers, it endures in those who fight for it. The first night I slept in the rebuilt cabin, I left the windows open. The sound of the lake lapped against the shore. The wind rustled through the trees, and the air smelled of fresh wood and pine. For the first time in months, I felt peace. Not because the battle had been easy, it hadn't, but because it had been worth it. Yet even in that peace I couldn't ignore the larger truth. My story was one of victory, but how many others never find that ending? How many homeowners watch their lives dismantled by HOAs that act with the same arrogance and cruelty Richard embodied, but without the fortune of having a family equipped to fight back? How many voices go unheard? How many lives quietly suffocated under the weight of unfair rules and fabricated authority? That question haunted me. It still does, because my story isn't just about a cabin, it's about power. It's about the danger of allowing small tyrannies to grow unchecked until they believe themselves invincible. It's about what happens when ordinary people are silenced by fear, when rules meant to maintain order are twisted into tools of oppression. Richard Alderman wasn't unique. He was a symptom of something larger, something woven into too many neighborhoods across the country. And yet my story is also about hope. Hope that even the most entrenched corruption can fall. Hope that silence can be broken, that fear can give way to courage. Hope that truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds a way to rise. I often think back to the moment Richard locked eyes with me in the hearing room, when he finally understood the depth of his mistake. He didn't just demolish a cabin. He challenged a legacy, a family, a principle stronger than any of his petty rules. In trying to erase me, he revealed himself. And in that revelation, he destroyed everything he had built. The cabin stands again now. It looks different, newer, but it carries the same spirit. Children run across its porch. Family gathers around its fire pit. Neighbors visit without fear, without shame. Laughter echoes across the lake once more. And sometimes in the quiet evenings, when the sun dips low and the water glows orange and gold, I sit on that porch and think about how fragile power is when it's built on lies, and how unbreakable legacy is when it's built on truth. Richard thought he ended my story, but in truth he became only a chapter in it, a cautionary tale written in arrogance and downfall. My story continues, stronger than ever, because it was never about one man or one cabin. It was about resilience, justice, and the refusal to bow to fear. And as I sit here, watching the lake stretch endlessly before me, I leave you with this: how many more cabins, how many more families, how many more legacies will be tested by the same forces of arrogance and control? And how many will stand, rebuild, and rise, refusing to let destruction be the final word? That answer isn't mine alone. It belongs to every voice willing to speak, every person willing to fight, and every community willing to stand together. The cabin stands again. Richard has fallen, the lake is quiet, but our story continues. And the question remains, what would you do if it were your home, your family, your legacy? Would you stand? Would you rise? Because sometimes the only way to protect what matters most is to refuse to kneel, no matter how powerful the opposition seems, and in that refusal lies the truest form of victory.